the civil rights movement. What will we talk about? Early years, education, work in the church, the Montgomery bus boycott, activism, I Have a Dream speech, assassination, and how he is honored today. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. Martin Luther King Jr. was born Michael Luther King Jr. on January 15, 1929. His parents were Alberta King, a school teacher, and Michael Luther King, a minister. Both men later on changed their names to Martin. Martin Luther King Jr. was born in Atlanta, Georgia. Georgia is a state found in the southeast of the United States, and Atlanta is its capital city. Martin Luther King had 2 siblings. Martin Luther King's grandfather was also a minister. The family had strong ties to the church, and Martin Luther King was well read in the Bible. He decided to follow in the footsteps of his father and his grandfather and become a minister as well. Martin Luther King attended Morehouse College in 1944 at the age of 15. His father and grandfather also attended Morehouse College. Martin Luther King graduated with a bachelor's degree in sociology in 1948. After completing Morehouse College, Martin Luther King attended Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in divinity in 19. After completing seminary, Martin Luther King attended Boston University. He graduated with a doctorate in theology in 1955. He was 25 years old when he completed his education. During his time in Boston, Martin Luther King met his future wife, Coretta Scott King. The two were married on June 18, 1953. Later on, in the 1960s, after Martin Luther King Jr. had already made a name for himself in the civil rights movement, he decided to join his father as co-pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. Martin Luther King's father and grandfather had been pastors of this church since before he was born. Martin Luther King served as co-pastor with his father up until his death. On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks, a seamstress in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to give her bus seat to a white passenger. According to U.S. segregation laws, white and black people were not allowed to sit on the bus together. Rosa Parks being asked to move by a white man was extremely common and also legal. Martin Luther King was elected to lead the Montgomery bus boycott because he was young, educated, had a solid family and professional standing. Furthermore, his recent arrival into Montgomery, Alabama meant that he had few enemies in the community. This was believed. While the boycott was considered the catalyst for the movement, the civil rights movement had already begun in the United States. This began with the landmark decision of Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. This Supreme Court case allowed black students to integrate into white-only public schools. Brown versus the Board of Education established that separate but equal was not equal at all. Rosa Parks was arrested for her refusal. The day of her conviction was the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott. The boycott lasted 382 days. The boycott ended after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that bus segregation was unconstitutional, also meaning it was illegal. Martin Luther King was successful in uniting the black community, and under the inspiration of Gandhi, established the nonviolent protests that we now know as key parts of the civil rights movement. He became a prominent leader and the face of the civil rights movement. He traveled throughout the United States, mostly through the South, speaking to black communities. He averaged about 208 speeches a year. Later on, his success in activism would win him the Nobel Peace Prize on December 10, 1965. This award would make him the youngest person in history to win the award at that time. We have no alternative but to protest. For many years, we have shown an amazing patience. We have sometimes given our white brothers. Martin Luther King's mission was to empower people, and in 1963, Dr. King organized the largest gathering of the civil rights movement, known as the March on Washington. 250,000 supporters gathered at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on August 28, 1963, to hear Dr. King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. In his speech, Martin Luther King expressed how he wanted the community to stick together, for leaders not to give up, for people not to be intimidated by threats and violence, for people to believe in themselves, and also to draw attention to the economic struggle that faced the black community. Lastly, he wanted people in the black community to know that they, as a nonviolent group, were a powerful weapon and a form of resistance. Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech is one of the most famous speeches in American history. Through Martin Luther King's efforts, in 1964, partly due to the March on Washington, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act. This legislation essentially eliminated legalized racism and segregation in the United States. In 1965, Congress also passed the Voting Rights Act. This legislation eliminated the remaining barriers for voting for African Americans. On April 4, 1964, Dr. King was assassinated while standing on his motel balcony in Memphis, Tennessee. He was assassinated by. In the wake of his death, waves of riots swept major cities across the country. President Johnson declared that day be a national day of mourning. Later on, James Earl Ray pled guilty to the murder of Martin Luther King Jr., and he was charged with 99 years in prison. After years of campaigning, members of Congress and Coretta Scott King, among others, convinced President Reagan to sign a bill creating the U.S. federal holiday Martin Luther King Day in honor of Dr. King. This legislation passed in 1983. Martin Luther King was celebrated for the first time in 1988 on the third Monday of January. His memorial was also built in Washington, D.C.